Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm TATEVIK AYVAZYAN. I'm the director of the Armenian Institute. Someone on Twitter that I follow said September 26 was the most wonderful day and we didn't know it. We have been living in a nightmare since the morning of 27th of September when we all woke up to a war. It's a war like any other war. It's cruel, mindless, bloody, but it's also a different kind of war because there is war on the ground, there is cyber war, there is war in the mud, there is war with high-tech drones, there is war with fake accounts and propaganda and trolls. And of course, it's a war in one of the most complicated corners in the world with lots of big powers involved. The situation is very grave at the moment, changing very quickly, and so many human lives are lost from both sides. This is why we have our three panelists tonight to discuss the conflict more in depth. We had to postpone some of our events due to the war, but this is an important conversation to have today, and we'll have more conversation about the conflict again soon. We also want to have some of our events back because, like Susan just reminded me, that there is more to being Armenian than being at war. So please keep an eye on our website, and we have a film screening coming up soon about the Abgar. Tonight we have three panelists who will be introduced to you soon, but we had also approached a fourth panelist, Maru Matosyan. Some of you will know her name. She is the executive director at the Women's Support Center in Armenia. She is tirelessly working, coordinating aid since the start of the war, and she's busy to helping people to join us tonight. But she has given us her kind permission to read some extracts from her diary she's been posting on Facebook for everyone to keep updated. So I'll read a few bits just for you. Her very first update is very short. It's very simple. She says, Stepanakert, border situation tense. Citizens are advised to go to shelters. Then in a few hours, she said, children in Stepanakert in bomb shelters. Day 4, situation is getting more serious, and she says, on TV we saw for the first time heavy damage to all region of Karabakh, especially to civilian dwellings. Since yesterday, heavy fighting and bombardment also took place in Armenia, in Vartanis and surrounding villages were particularly hard hit. One civilian was killed. A military barrack was hit, but fortunately it was evacuated in time. Also on the road, buses and civilian vehicles are also being shelled. A Turkish F-16 jet hit a Su-24 over the Armenian territory. Day 6, Mara tells us veterans of Karabakh will testify they have never seen the military technology and equipment that has been deployed during this war. The drones and tanks do most of the fighting. Day 7, when we can see everyone is involved, there are many people who we don't know, not even their names, but they are true heroes without medals, like the women who help with distribution aid, working on their feet all day long and carrying heavy boxes, or drivers who every day go back and forth to Karabakh to make deliveries, or doctors like Dr. Muradian, she had a picture attached, who is in the front line with his 2 children, or teachers who continue to work in bunkers, or women snipers who left children with relatives. By day 9, Maro says, today's Sunday, and the supermarkets are being emptied out by people buying for the army or for the displaced population from Karabakh. Even the Indian community in Yerevan is helping out. There's a slightly hopeful update on day 15. Saturday at noon, humanitarian ceasefire will take place, meaning recovery of fallen bodies, exchange of hostages, and no fighting. This is significant because until the Moscow talks, which lasted 11 hours, Aliyev didn't agree to ceasefire. We all know that ceasefire didn't happen, sadly. And the last thing Maro wrote was, International Red Cross didn't start to organize the exchange of prisoners of wars and recovery of dead bodies due to the continuation of bombardment. So this is her latest update. Now I'd like to invite my colleague Susan PATTIE, Armenian Institute's academic advisor and program manager, to introduce the panelists and explain the format of the session. As we have so many people joining tonight, and also for security, you cannot unmute yourselves, but you are almost welcome to ask your questions in the chat. We are also recording the event, so if you don't like to be seen, please turn off your cameras. So ask your questions in the chat line and we'll do our best to answer all of or most of your questions. So that's it from me. Thank you, Susan. Over to you.
Thank you, TATEVIK. And thank you to everybody for coming tonight. I know that there are almost nightly or daily very interesting discussions around the world. And the good part about Zoom is that we all have access to this. The bad part is the subject that we're talking about, of course. I'm very grateful, we're very grateful to the three speakers tonight who are in big demand because of their expertise, their experience, and we're very grateful to them for coming. It's not only a very tiring time to be an expert, but an extremely complex time because there's virtually nothing you can say that isn't going to change in the next moment or that won't anger somebody else if you make one person happy. So it's a tough time to be a commentator, and I think it's a special kind of courage to come out and do it in front of all of us who feel so strongly about this subject. So I just will say a word about how we're going to do it tonight and then introduce our speakers. We're asking each of them to speak in turn for about 6 minutes, and then I'm going to come in and ask them if they have any questions for each other for a further 5 minutes each. We'll go through that with our three speakers in discussion with each other. And then we will come to all of you, and as TATEVIK said, please use the chat line. For any of you who don't know where it is, it's at the bottom of your screen. Just hover your mouse over it and it'll come up chat. You can just click on that and then let everybody know what your question is. And we will then ask the speakers your question. Okay? And as Dato said, we do hope to have future events like this because things are changing. By the time we get out of here tonight, there will be new things that we didn't know about. But let me introduce our speakers tonight first. Our first speaker will be Laurence Broers. He's the co-founder and co-editor of the Caucasus Review, which is the only independent peer-reviewed and regularly published journal dedicated to the study of the Caucasus. In recent years, he's written or co-edited several books on the area, including Armenia and Azerbaijan, Anatomy of a Rivalry with Edinburgh Press. And he is co-edited with Anna Ohanyan of Armenia's Velvet Revolution, Authoritarian Decline, and Civil Resistance in a Multipolar World with IB Tauris. Laurence is also an associate fellow at the Russia and Eurasia Programme at the Royal Institute of International Affairs at Chatham House. Lilit Gevorgyan is the Russia and Commonwealth of Independent States principal economist at IHS Markit, and she's responsible for analyzing the macroeconomic, political, security, and business environment of Russia and the former Soviet republics. Lilit is well acquainted with the area, having lived and worked in Armenia, Russia, the Ukraine, and also in the US. She's a regular contributor to major media outlets and has made frequent guest appearances on BBC Radio 4's Today Show, as well as appearing in broadcasts by CNN, CNBC, Bloomberg, Al Jazeera, and others. And Armine Ishkanian is Associate Professor in the Department of Social Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's also the Executive Director of the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity Program at the International Inequalities Institute at the LSE. Her research examines how civil society organizations and social movements engage in policy processes and transformative politics. Armine is co-convener of the Politics of Inequality Research Program at the III. Her PhD fieldwork was in Armenia, and she has been researching and writing about civil society there and around the world since then. So thank you again to each of you. And with that short introduction, I would like to welcome Laurence Broers, who will be our first speaker.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you, TATEVIK, for organizing this and for inviting me to speak this evening. In my presentation, I'll try to very briefly address two questions, the why now question and the what now question. So in terms of why now, obviously the origins and drivers of this conflict is an immensely complex subject. I'll try to frame it perhaps in terms of three long-term factors. The first is an overwhelming military victory in 1994 for the Armenian sides, with the unique factor distinguishing this conflict from all the other conflicts that emerged in the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed, of overspill far beyond the territory that was initially disputed. And this military the asymmetry of the military victory increasingly came into tension with the disparity in development between smaller and natural resource poor Armenia and larger and natural resource rich Azerbaijan, notwithstanding all the caveats regarding corruption on which Azerbaijan hardly had a monopoly until 2018. A second factor, the embedding of a conflict narrative as the cornerstone of two national identities, whether as victor or victim, and the inability of political elites to moderate or dilute this in any way. They eventually adopted their respective narrative, albeit in different ways, as a sine qua non of political legitimacy and a consensus issue in each society. A third overarching factor is the shift from an American-led unipolar world based on liberal democracy to a multipolar world order contested by regional powers asserting authoritarian norms. And the Karabakh conflict and its mediation structures very peculiar position at exactly the meeting point of these different geopolitical and normative realms. Now, there's also a host of shorter term factors, the struggle for military initiative, arguably won by Azerbaijan in April 2016 and lost by it in July 2020, with unprecedented public protest in Baku in that month earlier this year. The dashed expectations of a post-Velvet reset after 2018's Velvet Revolution and increased offers of Turkish support in the context of an increasingly assertive Turkish foreign policy with its own domestic drivers and ample recent experience of engagement in regional conflict theatres. A set of speech acts and symbolic moves on the part of Nikol Pashinyan and Arayik Harutyunyan that were received and perceived as provocations in Azerbaijan. A pandemic with serious economic long-term implications for the political economy of authoritarianism across the region, and a global conjuncture defined by the distraction of major powers whose ability to set aside their differences on other issues and cooperate on this conflict had always been a key feature of its containment. So coming to the what now question, I can see three broad pathways of possible developments going forward. The first of these, which is currently dominating, is the logic of military outcomes on the battlefield. Developments on the ground appear to be taking the form of a contest between Azerbaijani aerial attrition using Turkish and Israeli drones and Armenian terrestrial control. There seems little doubt that drones have made a big difference, and there are all the reports of mercenaries and other forms of air power also being deployed. And this is making a critical difference to Azerbaijani military performance compared to April 2016. So it now looks, I think, rather unlikely that we'll see a limited operation to take back one or two occupied districts, and that there is a prospect of a larger military campaign to retake the whole of Nagorno-Karabakh. And under these circumstances, it would not be out of the question that Armenia would recognize the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic in order to facilitate the mobilization of weaponry and resources in Armenia in its defense. Now, this is Armenia's nuclear option. It's the last resort, and I would say a sign of weakness and not of strength. It would mean the end of the Minsk process as we know it, and without the relevant support of international players, could provide an additional casus belli for Azerbaijan. This would increase pressure on Russia to act or effectively risk seeing the basis for a permanent entry of Turkey into the South Caucasus. That raises the issue of what Russia can do. There is a base, of course, at Gyumri, but access and supply issues are incredibly complex. This is not the Donbass or even South Ossetia. The second pathway is the pathway of a geopolitical pact between regional powers, Russia and Turkey. Many observers actually believe that this is Turkey's goal, to establish a new deal with Russia that would see the two regional powers in control of a new mediation format along the lines of the Astana process initiated for Syrian peace talks in December 2016. For Russia, this outcome would suggest Moscow's transition from the informal leader of a multilateral coalition to a regional power managing it in a kind of duopoly with Turkey. And this would be a significant shift towards the proxification of this conflict. I've been arguing for years that this is not a proxy conflict. This is driven by local concerns and identities. But I think we are seeing an element of this coming in. But there's an important caveat. In Syria and Libya, Turkey and Russia have been supporting embattled factions in prolonged civil wars vulnerable to external leverage. Armenia and Azerbaijan are recognized states. They have their populations behind them. Their leaders have mandates to rule. And I'm not certain that if Azerbaijan feels that a successful military campaign is within reach, that it could be held back, nor that Yerevan could be restrained by Russia under those circumstances. The third pathway is a return to multilateral diplomacy, the re-embedding of the conflict within a revitalized OSCE-led process. This pathway recognizes essentially that Russia is the key actor with the most leverage across the divide, but seeks to appeal to the multilateralist face of Russia rather than its role as a geopolitical actor in its near abroad. The United Nations Security Council has affirmed the primary role of the OSCE, but gaps in OSCE capabilities would need to be addressed. There are two key issues, and these are some points that I've discussed in a Chatham House analysis that I published today, so a lot more detail there. There are two issues that a revitalized diplomatic process would need to address. The first of these is security. There have been agreements reached in May 2016 to strengthen the ceasefire infrastructure that were never fulfilled. There's never been a serious discussion about peacekeeping forces, and this only exacerbates the security dilemma that the sides feel. The other agenda needs to be movement in the direction of politics, in the direction of substantive negotiations. There haven't been any meaningful talks on the political issues for a decade. Now, Monday's Moscow declaration issued by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs underlines the continuation of the Minsk group and the framework set out by the basic principles, which offer a framework based, among other things, on Armenian withdrawals, initially from 5 districts around Nagorno-Karabakh, the deployment of peacekeeping forces, return of displaced communities, a corridor linking Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, interim status, and a final status vote. However, it's also clear that military outcomes could render many of these basic principles less relevant. So the basic principles set up a kind of a trade-off dynamic. One side gets this, the other side gets that. And this is based on pre-war patterns of control. If Azerbaijan succeeds in recovering much of the occupied territories around Nagorno-Karabakh and in weakening the Nagorno-Karabakh Defense Army, it may be less inclined to concede on such issues as interim status. Conversely, interim status would be made obsolete, of course, by any recognition of the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic. And there are signs that the very idea of interim status, which has never been accepted in Nagorno-Karabakh itself, will be overtaken by calls for remedial secession. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has again today underlined the existing format, but of the three pathways of development, I think that the movement along the pathways of military outcomes and Russian-Turkish deal-making is potentially faster than in the diplomatic pathway. And we are, I think, in a very perilous moment for all those in the line of fire across the divide and for all those who care about peace in this region. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Laurence. Thank you. I'm opening it now to Armine and to Lilit, if you want to come in and discuss any of those points with Laurence.
I will ask a quick question if I can. Laurence, what do you think about the Western interest, and particularly UK interest? You mentioned that it seems like the Russian, Turkish sort of power sharing is more likely scenario at the moment. You didn't mention Iran, which is sort of another question. But what about UK? What about the US? What about the political capital and indeed commercial investment in this region? What is it that keeps them sort of in a position of observers rather than actively involved mediators? What do you think about that?
Well, I think there are different categories amongst the Euro-Atlantic powers as such. I think one of the surprising and almost one of the defining characteristics of this crisis is the United States' absence. The United States was the last of the major powers to come up with a statement on 27th of September. And there is a very grave kind of lack of attention and interest, which fits with a broader pattern of US disengagement from key foreign policy issues. And I would argue also a dynamic whereby this conflict has always been perceived through the prism of a higher order policy priority, whether that is support for the global war on terror, whether that's managing the relationship with Iran, nuclear proliferation, and so on. The last time that the United States demonstrated or expended any serious political capital on this conflict was in 2001. So I think perhaps the United States, resuming, taking up again its role as a co-chair of the Minsk group would be a positive step. But as we know, the US is very distracted. We don't know who's going to be leader in a few weeks' time. And so, very much limited capacity and bandwidth of attention. With regard to the EU has always struggled to define a role for itself, given that France is, officially co-chair. The EU has supported peace-building initiatives, but I think has struggled to find a role in this conflict. France has typically seen its role more as an artifact of French diplomacy rather than representing the EU as such. But there are the other nations that are in the wider Minsk group. So the Minsk group is, of course, an 11 nation body. You also have 4 other EU member states: Germany, Italy, Sweden, and Finland. Sweden and Finland have previous experience as co-chairs of the Minsk group. There is an institutional history there. And as I wrote in the comment for Chatham House today, Sweden will be assuming the chair in office of the OSCE next year. So I think there is an opportunity here for Sweden, for Finland, Germany, and Italy to demonstrate more commitment to support, for example, at last, the holding of the Minsk conference that never happened back in the early 90s. For Britain, Britain doesn't have a direct role. It is implicated in the sense of, being a major investor in Azerbaijan. Britain has been a major investor in peacebuilding initiatives too. It is obviously a member of the United Nations Security Council. But again, I think Britain has traditionally, certainly over the last decade or so, seen its role as an EU member state and is now facing, I think, a broader crisis in defining its foreign policy and where the Caucasus fits into that. So, unfortunately, I think we're facing distraction, a lack of attention on this conflict, and so we have to underline this, I think, at every possible opportunity. It's crucial now that EU member states, that the EU support a broad coalition for de-escalation and stabilization.
Thank you. Thank you, Laurence. Thank you, Lilit. Armine, do you have a question for Laurence? A quick question, quick answer, none of these have quick answers, that's the problem. Okay, I'll say thank you to Laurence then, and Laurence will come back to you after the others have finished speaking. And Lilit, we'll go to you.
As Laurence was talking about the international factors that have contributed and elements of the conflict, a peace process and conflict resolution that have led to the current state of affairs. I thought that it would be very interesting for your audience also to look into the domestic and economic factors. Domestically, without going into further details, Armenia since 2018 is going through massive changes that are also having obviously foreign policy implications. After 2018 Velvet Revolution, Democratic Revolution, the country became the most democratic in the region. According to Economist Intelligence Unit Index, it even beat Georgia, so Armenians were quite proud of their achievements. At the same time, the most difficult decisions and reforms appear to have met some resistance from the ousted regime. And the key reform, as in case of Georgia and Ukraine, is still sort of hanging there, and that has been the dismantlement of the oligarchic system. What we've seen in both 2019 and beginning of this year is that the ousted regime and members of the oligarchy were sort of slowly uniting forces and seeking ways of challenging this revolutionary government. In doing so, they were also looking into their stronger relations with Russia, of course. So it wasn't beyond imagination that some sort of escalation along the line of contact, but again controlled escalation. And if had they ended with Armenian defeat, would have helped the opposition to weaken this government and stake claim for power. The handling of COVID crisis and also sort of the ongoing hybrid war was also weakening the current government standing. So what we ended up with in May this year, we had one of Armenia's prime ministers, former prime ministers, openly stating during his television interview, saying that Armenia is weak, and if I were Heydar Aliyev, I would have considered, now is the opportune time to attack. So these were the messages that were coming out from Armenia. If you were Azerbaijan, you're carefully monitoring, looking what's happening domestically. Now, moving to Azerbaijan, the dynamics is, of course, different. It's basically a family-run authoritarian country with very little political opening. However, Azerbaijan was supposed to hold its parliamentary elections in November 2020, so this year. But the elections were moved to February, and there were early elections were held. Many saw this as a process whereby the the elite in the country, the political elite, was seeing some transformation, and particularly the vice president and the wife of Haydar Aliyev, Ilham Aliyev, of course, Mehriban Aliyeva, who represents another influential family in Azerbaijan, that there was some sort of a power sharing going on behind the scenes. These are assumptions that are, of course, difficult also to substantiate, in the sense that you don't have an open press and you don't have open political discussions in Azerbaijan, but there were all these telltale signs that there is something happening, especially when you follow how they replace top people in the government, and who are they being replaced with. The parliament also was sort of modernized, and some of this new entrants into foray, they were seen as the reformers, or those who would like to introduce change in Azerbaijan from top down. To me, it read as a rejuvenation or facelift of the same family. However, it also meant that there is power consolidation happening in the hand of the family, and there is basically pathways being discussed of power transition. What does this mean for the conflict? It's very simple. Every time President Aliyev has felt that his power is threatened, the conflict has served well. An escalation, a controlled escalation, had always delivered good results. One example is 2016 war. And here I will go probably into economics to also explain some of the economic factors. Azerbaijan is one of the most energy dependent countries in the world. In the former Soviet Union, there are only two countries that are as dependent on energy exports as Azerbaijan. That's the other one is Turkmenistan. So COVID-19 outbreak, the historic crude oil price crash, meant that Azerbaijan is entering into a troubled time economically, and it will face, in fact, the steepest recession this year since early 2000s. Typically, when this sort of shock happens, Azerbaijan, Azeri Manat comes under pressure. And when it happened in 2014-15, the Azeri central bank was unable to support Manat and had to let it float. The end result was instant rise in social discontent, protests, because that led to high rates of inflation. And ultimately, it also contributed to the military campaign, a bit limited campaign against Nagorno-Karabakh in April 2016, the so-called 4-day war. When this conflict started, we did have some concerns that there's similar developments happening economically. And indeed, by June, July, President Aliyev was sensing that there is a lot of pressure building up. The reserves, whilst they're there, it is not really clear how much liquidity they have and how much they can afford to pay for the to deal with the consequences of the COVID-19, of course, and the lockdown. The pressure on Manat has been rising again, and I'll give you two figures just to give you an understanding what's happening. So from between January and August, the incomes from energy exports totaled at around $5.4 billion. Azerbaijani authorities have spent about $5.3 billion to support Manat, to keep it stable. It's effectively pegged to US dollars. The pressure is building on Manat, and you have to make changes. At the same time, there are concerns that, you know, the ruling family is taking hold of not only the power, they are also consolidating assets in what they call the Azerbaijani investment holding, which was created in August. So to go into a more difficult period where you have to you have to let Manat float, and there will be social unrest. You have to have some political capital. So our projection was that some sort of controlled escalation is likely, given the pressures, domestic pressures in Armenia, given Russia's sort of unhappiness with this revolutionary government, given the economic problems that Aliyev was facing, and they are protracted problems. We don't think that these oil prices are going to bounce back, so it will be quite difficult times ahead. Whereas if you show that you have been investing in war and you're bringing something back, at least at least your population will appreciate that it went into something that is justified for patriotic reasons or nationalistic reasons. And this is why I think that it's very important to look at the economic factors. Going back to what Laurence was saying, that I do not think that Azerbaijan can afford any Donbass-style conflict. It is out, I think, given its the structure of the economy, given its the importance of foreign investment, and given its dependence on energy pipelines that Azerbaijan quite often floats as, you know, to show the strategic importance of that, you cannot afford instability. What is quite concerning from my perspective is the willing import of Islamist militants. My other concern is the domestic stability in Azerbaijan, even if there is a military success. Whoever helps Azerbaijan, and in this case is Turkey, to deliver that victory will want something in return. The question that I asked about the West and Western interference also will impact ultimately who will be controlling those pipelines, who will be controlling those investments. If the West is out, it is not just about Azerbaijan, but also about any future projects that could have come from Central Asia. My concern is also that if it's Turkish-led support, if it's Turkish-led victory, then you also have to deal with the Turkish-style moderate sort of Islamic politics entering Azerbaijan. Azeri elite is very much, both politically and especially in terms of their business interests, are very much embedded with Russian and Kremlin, I would even say, business circles. To how do you deal with the arrival of Turkish political culture and obviously political leaders that are backed by Turkey? How do you deal with the mercenaries? So in conclusion, I'd say that economic constraints will be quite significant for Azerbaijan. But also, even if there's a victory, I think that ultimately the Azerbaijan has opened itself to sort of instability that can impact the process of the conflict. So the overconfidence that we can crash and move forward and the question is closed, I think it's probably false. And this is just the beginning of the problems that the region will face. Thank you.
Thank you, Lilit. That's quite scary prospects there. Armine has a question for you, I believe.
Sure.
And if we could keep it sort of short, that would be great, so we can go on. Armine, are you unmuted?
Thanks for unmuting me. Thank you. I have two quick questions. One is for both Laurence and Lilit. And the second is for Lilit more specifically. So I'll ask the one for Lilit. Thanks for the presentation, by the way. It was very interesting. You were talking about the discontent in Armenia and the opposition. And I would just ask you to reflect on 2016, when the discontent was far more in Armenia, particularly against the authoritarian and oligarchic regime, and why, that war went the way that it did. And in fact, we know now that some of those oligarchs, such as General Manvel, were hoarding supplies meant for the army. So, there's that one question about the 2016 and why it wasn't, if that was the situation, if Armenia was weak. The second question to Laurence and to Lilit, it's around Turkey's role. Obviously Turkey has always supported Azerbaijan, but why do you think it's so active right now? Why has it become much more active than it has ever been in the past 26 years, almost 3 decades?
Thank you.
Thank you. Great questions. I think it's a very good question, actually. What was the difference between the discontent in 2016 and discontent now? The 2016 discontent, I say, was genuine, whereas now what we're seeing is an engineered discontent. That was the difference. And this is where I mentioned the hybrid war. I mentioned tensions with Russia. Tensions between Russia and the current Armenian government, despite all the efforts of the current government to make sure that Russia wasn't sort of nervous about what Armenia will do in its foreign policy and whether there will be shifts. So I think that was the difference. And also in 2016, I believe that there was no intention of there was no plans by Azerbaijan to solve the conflict. As I said, it was always seen as a good opportunity to get some political capital after or before difficult decisions in Azerbaijan. It was also a continuation of the logic that was set in by Russia from 2010-11, when the Lavrov plan was put in place, and then Russia deliberately, effectively changed the balance of power between the two countries by starting arming Azerbaijan. So this is where I see 2016 conflict playing out. Whereas now, to answer the second question as well, I think Aliyev feels that there are big changes ahead and big challenges ahead, and you have to solve this conflict one way or another. I think the democratic revolution in Armenia also concerned Azerbaijan gravely, because whereas the other the previous regime and the previous leaders were predictable, they were of the same ilk, so to speak. But when you have someone who's democratically elected, you know that they will be less easy to manipulate, if I could put it this way. So I think this is why he had to shop around to see who will help him. And I think Turkey, given what Laurence was describing, the opportune moment came. And obviously a lot of planning has gone into this. You cannot just simply launch something of this scale. But that's my interpretation.
Thank you. Laurence, do you have a question for Lilit before we go on to Armine?
Yes. We can come back to the Turkey issue perhaps a bit later on. Lilit, thank you for your presentation. Just one quick question. I mean, I thought when this started that it might be another controlled escalation of the kind that we saw in April 2016, but it does seem to be a much more ambitious campaign. I mean, the shelling of population points and just the scale of what we're seeing, it seems so much more than a controlled escalation. So how do you see that? Are we still talking about the playbook of controlled escalations, or actually something much more wide-ranging and potentially comprehensive? And why is that? Does that signal really deep concern on the part of the Azerbaijani government that, you know, really rough times are coming. It seems all or nothing at present.
My impression is that this was supposed to be controlled takeover rather than escalation.
Mm-hmm.
It was supposed to be controlled takeover of at least 1 or 2 regions, if not more, and it was supposed to be quick and clean and with Turkish support and Russia's silence. That's my impression, but I think the 2016 reconnaissance also revealed that if you have air superiority and if you apply the Idlib tactics of sort of carpet bombing and then moving on, then you will be able to crush the resistance that they couldn't do in 2016, especially when you have Turkey on your side. That plan didn't work, and there's no going back. Too much has been invested. Mark, one question that I still cannot answer, maybe you can help me to answer. I really don't understand who and how someone in Azerbaijan, top echelon, decided that it's a good idea to bring in Islamist militants. It is something that is just shocking to me. I just don't understand, because that's an element in itself. It's a very clear sort of blueprint. Whether they were supposed to come in quickly and, you know, shipped out whoever stays alive, maybe that was the plan. I'm just speculating, but as it drags on, and I know that the victory, the Turkish-Azeri victory sort of scenario, seems very nice and clean, and, you know, brings a solution. But to me, there are various elements that suggest that actually this can get out of control. I think it has already gotten out of control, and I think the political changes, domestic political changes, will probably follow. So Azerbaijan is probably entering quite a period of instability. But remember that this is, in this scenario, Turkey effectively has shaken a balance of power of 30 years. Whether Armenia has links with Russia or not, Azerbaijan and Armenia are buffer states. Someone came in and destroyed that effectively, or in the process of doing that. And this is where, you know, Iran, I don't think will completely remain silent. It's a time of calibrating how they will be dividing it up, and that's why if I were Georgia, I would be very concerned. That's what I would say, and the West, of course.
Thank you very much, Lilit, and thank you for your presentation. There's a lot that we'll have to be talking about afterwards, I think. But before we get to that point, let's go to Armine for our last speaker this evening. Armine, would you like to take the center stage now?
Thank you. Thank you, Susan and Dato, for inviting me. And it's been a pleasure listening to Lilit and Laurence. I'm going to shift gears somewhat and go from the realm of geopolitics to talking about societies, and specifically thinking about kind of the politics of civil society, both local, regional, but also global civil society. I think we all probably agree that peace is of the utmost importance, but from what we've been hearing, it's unclear how peace is going to be achieved. And, you know, the reason I asked about Turkey's involvement is because, to me, this is the biggest factor kind of blocking peace, in my opinion, now, more than anything, more than ever before, because without Turkey's involvement, there may have been a possibility of a diplomatic solution. But from the Armenian side, it seems that Turkey's involvement has really thrown a wrench in the works, a spanner in the works. So it's been 16 days, and as TATEVIK said, our lives have been turned upside down. Every Armenian I know is now busy watching the news, tweeting, writing, raising funds. But of course, this is not the only story. And I think it's important to recognize the different responses. So in Armenia, civil society has been, as I said, mobilizing around mutual aid and solidarity. There have been a few calls for peace. But generally, it's been a unified front in terms of supporting the government, generally, I would say. The diaspora has also put aside differences it had with Pashinyan's government, the different diaspora political parties, and committed to raising funds, leading protests, engaging in advocacy activities. Some in Los Angeles are even leading a campaign to boycott Turkish goods, going around all of the supermarkets. Now, those are the activities around kind of this ethnic solidarity position. Across countries, there seems to be very few kind of connections that at this time, and perhaps fewer than has ever been in the past 30 years. So while Azerbaijani leftist activists issued a call for peace, they are in the very minority within their society. And in fact, there's been a disappointment among some Armenian civil society activists with those who they consider their allies. One name comes to mind, Khadija Ismailova, who many had thought was a human rights defender and outspoken critic of Aliyev's regime, has now taken to Twitter and Facebook posting pro-government positions. So why I'm bringing this up, because this is an important point in terms of if you are going to create peace, you need dialogue. And if we're thinking not just track one diplomacy between states, but track two diplomacy between peoples, I see that group of people, which was already small, shrinking even further. Who is going to now speak in terms of or engage in these track two diplomacy efforts? Who is going to be willing to talk to each other across the borders? And I think this is an issue, because if peace is going to come, that is also a necessary element that needs to be there. But I think what we've seen is a decline of mistrust over the past 30 years, in part because the generation now has never lived with one another. So there's a great deal of alienation and a lack of kind of understanding between them. And I would say even further that after 2016, that trust declined. And in terms of, how peace building has gone forward for the past 30 years, there's also been an element that these efforts have really been at the margins of the societies. They have been, the people involved have been the progressive, liberal-minded young people, mostly living in the capitals. And they're thinking those ideas around peace never permeated to the general population, and particularly to those living in the front lines of this conflict. So I think there are these issues. I've spoken about the Armenian, Azerbaijan civil society efforts. We also saw in Turkey, not necessarily Turkish civil society, but Turkish Armenian civil society calling for peace, and particularly recognizing their own vulnerable position within that country. But what I'd like to focus on a little bit is the global civil society, the international NGOs, the international non-governmental organizations, human rights groups, humanitarian groups. In recent days, particularly from Armenia, there has been a lot of criticism of these groups, what some people call the both-sidism, that they've made false equivalences of the parties involved in the conflict, that they have not recognized the human rights violations that have occurred. And in particular, an issue has been raised about the human rights violations of the population of Nagorno-Karabakh, of Artsakh, which is an unrecognized state, as people have asked. Do people in unrecognized states still have human rights, or are they outside of the boundaries of human rights? And I think this is an important question, because as I'm not an expert of conflict, but I know a lot about humanitarianism and NGOs. That is my field of expertise. And within that field, for decades, there's been a debate around humanitarianism and neutrality. This dates back to World War II, when the International Society when the ICRC, the Red Cross, came into a lot of criticism, particularly after the war, for being silent on the basis of neutrality during the Holocaust, where they knew precisely what was happening and they did not speak out. Now, since then, they have profusely apologized, saying there is a time to speak and there is a time to be silent. But they've also recognized that there was an absence of public condemnation and what they call, and this is their words, a timidity of confidential representations, recognizing their failures. Now, for Armenians who have survived a genocide 105 years ago, I think there is this concern about the international community and what the international community does or does not do. And I think a lot of voices are saying, let's not put ourselves into a situation again where 10 years, 20 years down the line, people say, oh, we should have spoken out, but we didn't. So I think these words of ICRC are very important. There is a time to speak and there is a time to be silent. And of course, I don't want to put all NGOs into one basket. There's Médecins Sans Frontières, which has rejected neutrality. And this position of theirs came after the Biafran War in Nigeria, where they noticed that the Nigerian government was bombing and starving and blockading its own people. And they took a different position and they chose to speak out. Now, obviously, it is very difficult, but when we look at the situation where you have 3 million people in Armenia, 150,000 people in Artsakh, you have 80 million people in Turkey, 10 million in Azerbaijan, the unmatched military might, I think there is a situation which calls for a more nuanced approach rather than one which says, oh, both sides are doing these things. So I think in terms of peace, we are in a very, very difficult position. I think the diplomatic solution that Laurence mentioned is particularly weakened given the 16 days of war and the bloodshed and the mistrust that existed and has only now been heightened. And I think, you know, at this point, I am not very hopeful of what is going to happen. But I think, you know, it is very important to still continue to find ways that will not lead to mutual destruction on all sides and further destabilizing of that region. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Armine. And perhaps we can discuss how what some of those ways might be this evening. Lilit and Laurence, do you have any questions for Armine?
Yes, I can ask a question. Obviously, I work for an international peacebuilding NGO, and it is incredibly difficult to uphold the image of impartiality and neutrality. With regards to the current situation, I mean, we've often been accused of supporting marginal voices that don't actually represent the majority view in Azerbaijan, in Azerbaijani society. We don't have very reliable indicators of what public opinion really is in Azerbaijan. It's been 7 years since the last Caucasus barometer was carried out. There are issues with carrying out opinion polls. But one kind of question that I am sometimes asked in Azerbaijan, or a kind of a comment or response on this, is that, you know, if we saw that there was a liberal critique of occupation and a discourse around the injustice of internally displaced communities from the surrounding territories in particular, then we would, you know, have more grounds. And it's how do we kind of, you know, there is this notion that these things have to be reciprocal or symmetrical. I believe that you have to, you know, be concerned about these issues for the good health of your own society, irrespective of whether that's happening on the other side or not. So I suppose that's just a long-winded way of saying, why is it that there hasn't been a kind of an Armenian liberal critique in the way that there is amongst many Israelis, for instance, of occupation in the West Bank? How do you see that issue?
That's a good question. I think, you know, there is a liberal critique, but it's minute. Just like the left in Armenia is very small and marginalized. And I think, you know, they have been drowned out by more nationalist voices. And again, you know, I think the issues that have concerned them have not been around, you know, this has not been kind of their main issue. They have been much more focused on domestic politics. And I would say for many, many years, the liberal left in Armenia, or not necessarily the left, but the liberal parties within civil society were much more focused on internal dynamics and issues. And I think those who were involved in the peace building processes, I think, you know, they were attempting to reach out to wider kind of layers of society through educational programs, through curriculum building. But I think it was never an approach that was going to succeed in terms of Armenia because of again, this fear. And I think we cannot take out, again, the historical dynamic of fear of genocide, fear of being weakened and ethnic cleansed and being ethnically cleansed. And I think that fear, given Turkey's continued refusal to recognize the 1915 genocide, is why you don't have more of this position within that. That's my opinion.
Thank you.
Can I ask one more question, if I may? I mean, what do you think will be the impact of the EU sort of Western lack of reaction to this ongoing tragedy on the Armenian civil society? Because we have a post-Soviet generation that grew up and they fought and fought for, you know, various issues, environmental, different sort of more narrow issues, and then ultimately that culminated in the revolution. And all along, the idea was to bring Armenia closer to Europe, and, you know, appreciating values and making sure that during this revolution all the European conventions and all the laws were protected, and nothing illegal happened. And then you have a situation where effectively you have a NATO member actively involved in a conflict, and you see that most of the population, well, at least half of the population, according to reports of Nagorno-Karabakh, are fleeing. You're seeing this horrendous thing, and you're seeing, you know, concerned and then extremely concerned, very concerned statements. What will this do? Is this Armenian societies so waking up to the new world of realpolitik? And are we going to see a much more maybe down to earth look at who do you trust, who do you work with, who do you not trust? And is this, going back to what Laurence is saying, will there ever be any room, given, you know, what's happening, and the last voices in Azerbaijan are dying out and joining the war rhetoric? Don't you think that? Do you think what will be the damage, or do you think that it can bounce back?
I think it's a good question, Lilit. I think it's, sadly, I mean, I'm really pessimistic at this point in terms of bouncing back. I think there is a disillusionment with Europe, with the West, in terms of the lack of reaction. And I think, you know, there is this sense of, I mean, the word hypocrisy has been thrown about in terms of respect towards human rights. And I think, you know, the Armenian ombudsman, the Artsakh ombudsman keep submitting reports, but it's like, where is this going? How is this going to be treated? And I think there is this sense among Armenians of closing in. This is isolation. It's us and ourselves, and that's it. And I think that kind of mentality, while justified in some sense, I think is also very dangerous. And so I think, but you cannot blame them for what they're feeling, because in this, what they feel is in our hour of need, the world has forgotten us, right? And so the fact that in Los Angeles, Armenians took to blocking freeways in order to get on the news when they are a huge population in that city and have been protesting otherwise, meant that they had to go to these radical, taking a page out of Black Lives Matter playbook in order to get that attention. But I think, where we are right now is someplace where we haven't been in the past 30 years. And that's a very dangerous place. And just to say to Laurence, I do recognize the challenges of working in an international organization, international NGO, and I do understand, it's not that I'm blind to it. I just, I think it's important to kind of also push that debate a little bit forward and to think critically about the role of different actors, particularly when I know that international organizations, international NGOs have more power, have more voice than local domestic civil society to speak. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I fully appreciate that.
Thank you to each of you and to the discussion. We have a lot of questions now. Am I muted or unmuted? Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I can't tell. Thank you very, very much to each of you. And we have many, many questions in the chat line. If I could just bring a few of them together, because there are quite a few along the same lines. One, Armine Marsupian has asked if there will be a blowback in Azerbaijan due to the high casualties that are there. I think my opinion is that generally that makes people more insular, more, angry, and more feeling more like they can't forgive the other people. But perhaps you have other ideas. The other thing that keeps coming out here is a number of people have asked about Russia's position and what will be the line in the sand that nobody can, that when they cross that they will finally come in. And will they come in? I think that's another question. Has Russia's position changed enough so that they are trying to play both sides against each other and then come out somehow on top, basically, they will, with a new order that puts them more going back to the multipolar and unipolar positions discussion that we had earlier. That's a little roundup of some of the questions that have been asked. And probably you each have something to say on that, I imagine. Anybody?
I can kick off and just please tell me to stop if I go on too long. On the issue of casualties, it's not clear to me what people know. There's been a lot of internet lockdown, so it's really not clear to me that people are aware of the losses. And I was tweeting about this today. It seems to me that the question for Azerbaijan at present is whether the territorial gains made so far are sufficient, A, to reshape the peace process in the way that it would like and to have the leverage, and B, to survive any backlash once the true extent of losses becomes clearer. So I'm not sure that people are fully aware of the degree of casualties to date. Azerbaijan, of course, doesn't publish its formal casualties. On Russia, there are these two different views. One is that there's a kind of grandmaster of geopolitics who's hanging back in the Kremlin, allowing Azerbaijan and Turkey to take down the Velvet Revolutionary regime a few notches, to put Pashinyan in his place, to remind Armenia of its dependency on Russia, and perhaps to swoop in with a Russian-dominated peacekeeping operation or peace plan as its price for coming in and defending Armenia. I'm not particularly convinced by that argument. I think there's more a breakdown of Russia's policy over the last 15 years, which I've written about in an article in EurasiaNet that I term pivotal deterrence. Russia has been pivoting between Armenia and Azerbaijan through the period of Azerbaijan's oil boom and preponderance, balancing with a range of different policies, whether this is arms transfers to both, military alliance with Armenia, mediation initiatives. But that policy has worked because there haven't been alternative alliance options, and Turkey's entry has disrupted that system. What are Russia's red lines? I'm pretty sure that Russia does not want to see an extended conflict that would embed a Turkish presence in the South Caucasus and effectively, establish the South Caucasus as two spheres of influence effectively. That presupposes a kind of a diminishing of Russia's role from being the informal leader of the Minsk group, of this international coalition aiming to resolve the conflict, and its reduction to just being another regional power contesting these issues with Turkey. So I think that's a red line. And so practically, what does that mean? Would an all-out offensive plus a ground offensive involving ethnic cleansing of Karabakh Armenians, would that be a red line? I'm afraid nobody knows. But in my view, the Karabakh conflict, as it has existed, has been the key source of leverage for Russia over the South Caucasus as a whole, much more important in a way than Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And I can't imagine that it wants to see that source of leverage disappear completely.
Thank you, Laurence. Lilit or Armine, do you want to add to that? Or are we done?
I think Laurence covered most of the points.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. TATEVIK, you've been watching the line, you, I think, had a question yourself. Do you want to come in at this point?
Yes, there are quite a few questions in the chat, and I had a quick question myself to all three panelists, whoever wants to respond to this. I'd like to ask about minorities in both countries, because I keep seeing two tendencies. While there is very heartwarming process in Armenia of more acceptance, and from Yazidi and the Syrian communities, they've been joining, forming their own volunteer groups. At the same time, from Armenian side, we hear a lot about discontent from Talish and Tezgin minorities, which are quite sizable in Azerbaijan. What's your view on it? Are they likely to have some impact in what's happening in Azerbaijan? To all three of you.
I think, in terms of, as you've already pointed out, TATEVIK, that, there is the support of Assyrians and Yazidis in Armenia. And, I think to some extent, the Armenian side was calling out the issue of Azerbaijan using and putting forward their ethnic minorities in terms of the frontline action. And I think this links back to a question Lilit raised about the jihadists or the mercenaries. I think there's also this sense that those two are also being used in terms of frontline, forces, so as to minimize the casualties of Azerbaijanis in terms of, Aliyev, again, not facing negative backlash from his own population of, it's these others who are dying on the front lines. But I think, there is an element, again, that we unfortunately don't have that much information about Azerbaijan. I think we have much more information about what's going on inside Armenia, but with Azerbaijan, it's, the information, the research is not, from my perspective, what I've seen, I wouldn't say it's as robust as in terms of what we find about Armenia. But colleagues may differ in terms of their opinion.
Thank you.
I wouldn't have anything specific to add, except that there's an interesting study called Divided Armies that looks at the effectiveness of battlefield performance relative to social equality in the society, since armies are, of course, a reflection of societies. The name of the author escapes me. It was Princeton University Press. It strikes me that Armenia and Azerbaijan would be interesting case studies to look at that issue for. I think, yes, there will be destabilizing effects perhaps for identity politics coming out of this, but we don't have a lot of information. There's also a lot of propaganda out there, so I wouldn't say anything more on that myself at this stage.
Thank you, Laurence, and thank you, everyone. I'll read out one of the questions we have in line from Serene, it's a question for Laurence and Lilit, who says Western sanctions have been successfully deployed in 2019 and 2020 to restrain Turkey in its involvement in wars in Syria and Libya. How feasible do you think it is to pass sanctions against Turkey in European Parliament to restrain its fueling war in Caucasus? How feasible to pass action against the inner circle of Alev for cluster bombing on civilian centers? Mr. Joseph Borrell in European Parliament proclaimed that Turkey sanctions will be discussed in December. What does it take to achieve fast and decisive sanctions to stem the bloodshed now? It's both for Laurence and Lilit, I think.
It's a very difficult question. I mean, in terms of the process, I mean, I have started to see this issue being discussed along with the discourse of remedial secession, which I think is going to become much more visible and prominent. As for EU capacity to do that, as I understand, the sanctions and the threat of sanctions have been effective, also in the context of the Eastern Mediterranean disagreements. But what, I mean, that's one set of issues, but what also worries me and what I've really noticed over the last 2 weeks is a massive disillusionment with Western experts, with Western expertise in Azerbaijani social media space. People like me called Orientalists, imperialists, Islamophobic, that this is determining our stance on around our analysis on this. And I find this really a worrying trend. And my fear is that sanctions would contribute to that and would embed and give more grist to the mill of a civilizational discourse around what this conflict is about, which I think is wrong. I don't think it is about that. Yeah, that's just a rather kind of mixed up answer. I think it's possible, but it would have, I think, long-term and quite damaging and disturbing implications for Azerbaijani-European relations separately from the goals of the sanctions and what they might achieve in the short term.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm going to disagree with Laurence here. I think in a very unlikely case, in fact, deciding not to impose sanctions on a country because they might become more sort of anti-European implies that you've decided that they are not part of Europe in the first place and you don't want to widen that gap. Whereas considering that, both countries are at the frontier of Eastern Europe, really, part of Middle East, and ultimately we all have to, whether we are disappointed or not, it is what Europe is upholding at the moment. Those values, they work. They create strong societies, good economies, good environment for living. If you start picking if Belarus deserves sanctions, and another country, Azerbaijan, doesn't, because they will be upset, I think it might be a form of discrimination. Sanctions politics is quite interesting. It has to do with a number of factors. from Armenian perspective, even the threat of those should be enough to put the process in the right direction. What we're really seeing in this region is perpetual violence of a horrible kind. And it seems like the problem is how it is interpreted or seen by Western experts. And they do have that dismissive attitude that, well, it's Caucasus, they're used to this. This is what they do. They're not like us. However, what I also notice is that once you're slightly further away from the EU border, all of a sudden it's all about geopolitics of 19th century, where these nations and mass displacement and ethnic cleansings are all of a sudden are just part of the game, because some analyst or group of analysts or lobbyists have decided that, well, there are ways of solving issues, and if we manage to get the media away from it and just cloak it with various types of geopolitical analysis, then you can do it. In this environment, any discussion of peace building, I'm sorry, it's just absolutely unrealistic, and it just became even more unrealistic in the past 16 days. So this is why I would bring back again more sort of realpolitik approach to this. What about the West? Because if the West decides that their interests are indeed threatened, then I think that you will see more reaction. And I do think that they are, because if we're going into using the Syrian model, then it automatically implies that you don't really have the Western presence on the ground. So I think that's how it is. But with the normative approach that something bad has happened and someone has to be held accountable, that would have been great. But it's not. It hasn't been applied really uniformly, and unlikely to be applied. So I would just say, look how countries will determine whether their interests are impacted, and that will give you an idea whether this will happen or not.
Could I just clarify? I wasn't saying that one shouldn't consider sanctions simply because that. I was just trying to think through the implications and observing what I've been seeing in these last 2 weeks. And I absolutely agree with you that because the Caucasus, because Armenia and Azerbaijan are quite obscure for many people, there's always a simplification process. It's about religion, it's about geopolitics, it's about pipelines. It's just a peg, it's a hook that people can place these countries. That's why we have all these references to mainly Muslim Azerbaijan and mostly Christian Armenia. It's nothing to do with the conflict. And I do try as much as I can to present the complexity. It's often not wanted, that's the problem.
Very good point, Laurence. I want to say to everybody that thank you for all your questions, but there are so many and they're so interesting that I have to say we're not going to get to all of them. I'm choosing one which was one of the first ones, which is also touched on by a number of other people, and I think in discussion some of the other questions will be covered, I hope. From Hofsep Babayan, why is Russia not reacting more to the presence of Syrian pro-Turkish terrorists in Nagorno-Karabakh, as traditionally Russia has been sensitive to such issues? And related to that, Putin's ceasefire has been broken. Is that a sign that Russia's influence in the region is not so firm as people thought it was? And could we go related to that, what you've just been touching on now is the lack of allies that Armenia has generally. Or as somebody put it recently, why has Armenia been abandoned? So if we could talk about this big sighs from you guys, but these are questions we're all concerned about, and I think they have a lot to do with how we go forward here.
Well, on the issue of why Russia hasn't reacted more, I mean, it's impossible to believe that Russia was completely surprised by this. I think it's clear that a long process of planning was involved, but we don't know whether perhaps whatever was kind of perhaps tacitly agreed has been exceeded in terms of scale and scope. I was reading an analysis by Maxim Suchkov, who was saying that while Azerbaijani troops could hardly be construed as a legitimate target for Russian military power, use of force, Syrian foreign fighters certainly could be, and that could be a red line that is activated in the coming days and weeks. And with regard to Armenia's isolation, in my book I write about both Armenia and Azerbaijan actually as geopolitical outsiders. Armenia is, in a sense, the skeptic Eurasian state. It's part of Russian-led structures, but not really willingly so. Armenia is in this paradoxical position of, identifying itself to a considerable extent with Europe, seeking an association agreement with the European Union, being forced to renounce it, and yet being kind of on the wrong side of the normative conjuncture around territorial integrity and secessionist entities. So in that sense, Armenia is an outsider in all geopolitical camps, and that is what has made it, I think, vulnerable to this balancing strategy as implemented by Russia, and particularly because of the asymmetry in terms of aggregate economic, military, political influence. And that's where the diaspora has played, I think, a very crucial role in helping to alleviate that asymmetry, offering Armenia a lot of soft power, softening the image of Armenia until 2018 as an authoritarian state, which it was. But ultimately, yeah, Armenia is quite isolated. Yeah, those would be my comments on that issue.
Thank you. Lilit or Armine, do you want to answer that, or shall we go on?
Yeah, I can't speculate about Russia's behavior, what it will do.
I'll just say that about Armenia's isolation, just to add, Laurence really nicely put that. But I'll just say that it had to do also with the domestic political factors and also the Turkey factor. I think that's the main factor. You just have a country that is a NATO member and they're refusing to recognize genocide, and it's not just historical question as we as it played out now. So there was this gap between where Armenia wants to be and where it can be. Because ultimately your survival trumps every type of value systems, and that's and I think from Armenian perspective they feel that it is really unfair that they've tried their best to accommodate the two, and yet it wasn't recognized. I do not think that that conflict had to do anything with that. There are other conflicts that, since the often quoted and totally irrelevant, that say UN resolutions, you have the law has advanced, you have Timor less, you have Kosovo and so forth. So this I think it was more of an excuse. The big elephant was you have Turkey and it's more important, and it's not even pipelines. This is what it is. You have, and we've seen this playing out when Armenia was trying to also have a greater role in NATO and the opposition that was coming from Turkey. So that issue has never been addressed.
No. Could I just add, I mean, to what Lilit said, I think here Turkey's role is really the biggest issue. And for me, I think it's the position of Erdogan, his policies of, you know, he's not even hiding the neo-Ottomanism, the neo-imperialism, whether it's, you know, looking west towards Greece or east towards the Caucasus, it's in plain sight. And it's astonishing that we're only 11 years away from what used to be called, you know, zero problems with neighbors, and, you know, the football diplomacy euphoric era. And now, you know, it seems to be definite problems with all neighbors. You know, this is where we are. So I think this is something that has to be taken into account. And going back to what Lilit said about Europe not taking things seriously, I mean, the fact that Greece is an EU member, Cyprus is an EU member, and, you know, these are considerations that simply seem to be ignored.
Yeah, I mean, Cyprus had to effectively blackmail and say, I'm not going to back the sanctions against some third country, Belarus, unless you listen to me. And I think there is a problem, and it's not being addressed, and it's ultimately is going to undermine European and Western security system.
Absolutely.
But it will be too late for Armenians. That's my fear.
Yeah.
Thank you, all of you. We've hit 9 o'clock, and I need to ask our speakers if you're willing to have one last question, or do you want you're okay?
One last question is okay. Yeah.
One last question is okay. I'm going to let TATEVIK ask that, and I'm just going to say something that Norica has just put up in the thing. It was very simply that Turkey, following on from that, has recently opened up Varosha, which was closed as a bargaining chip for decades, and now has illegally been opened up. So Erdogan is making all kinds of moves at the same time. It's hard to keep track. But as far as the ethnic cleansing, the denial of genocide, he seems to have given up on that one, because he says he's going to be continuing the work of the grandparents, which can only refer to that. So, TATEVIK, would you like?
Yes, I'd like to first apologize to everyone whose questions didn't get asked, but we are thinking of a way of creating some sort of a forum on our website. We'll mention it on our social media. We can continue the conversation.
Could I just say something at this point about that, TATEVIK, just that we are going to have more talks, and we're going to look very carefully at the questions and probably shape the next one around some of the questions that came up in your talk, in the chat line. So thank you to everybody for contributions.
Absolutely. And looking at most questions, there are quite a few questions about press and media, and lots of questions about what do you think about the future. So if we can ask one quick question, others from Tatiana Deravedisyan. How do you explain the Western media's ambivalence towards the conflict? It's been discussed briefly, but not explored properly. Why are they struggling to recount the facts? Is the propaganda war that strong? Is there a concern of influence on foreign press reporting? There are only a handful of journalists accurately reporting on this conflict. There have been a number of articles highlighting past acts of corruption and an extent of Aliyev influence on US and European politicians and their policies. Why this is not being highlighted more? Does anyone of our panelists want to go first? Armine, you look like you want to say something.
I mean, you know, in an era where politicians have called media, fake news, and all kinds of things. I think we're all quite aware that media interests are owned and operated by particular interests, and so whose interests are being served by the reporting is, I think, an important question to ask. When it comes down to the public service broadcaster in this country, I think, again, people are asking questions of, why is it being reported? Why is there only a reporter, this is from yesterday, in Ganja, and no one was reporting the issue from the other side, in terms of Stepanakert, for instance. I think, we do have to be aware that each news organization is going to have its own spin. But in today's world, with social media and people able to also shape narratives there, I think we're seeing a huge battle in the field of, Twitter particularly, but not just, also Instagram and Facebook. And I think, these are arenas that have perhaps not been present. I mean, definitely not in the first Karabakh war, right? You didn't have that. So I think it heightens the dynamic in certain ways, but it also complicates things in terms of, who can you trust and what is being reported and fact-finding and so forth. So I don't think that's necessarily a question about why they're reporting it in that way, apart from to say, again, going back to realpolitik, I think Lilit mentioned, we need to look at interests.
Laurence, Lilit, do you want to add to this question about press?
I think some of the answer was in the question, because I would add one more angle, by the way. There's a very small pool of experts on this, on the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, and there has always been, as Laurence was saying, it's, you need a hook. And when you have journalists who don't have much information about the conflict, and they want to pitch the story or have to cover it, then they will need a hook. Then they will, overplay the issue of pipelines, which, by the way, is not really that relevant. And they, as far as I can see, it's flowing pretty well, the oil and gas. So there's always that simplifying the conflict and by that damaging it. There's also the problem of the methodology of reporting. So if you talk about say a destruction of mass destruction on one side, then you're told to go and find out some images of saying that, oh, but and the other side is suffering and so forth. So this false balance is where the problem is, and it has been an issue, starting with climate change, and then with conflict. You always have that false balance, and in the end, the news organizations are not delivering the service, and this is where the frustration comes. In addition, as was mentioned in the question, there has been Armenians relied on grassroots activism or lobbying, but on the Azerbaijani side, it's well established. They have been done through all top PR agencies who have the contacts and they know how to strategize. And in the end, from what appears coming from Azerbaijan is sort of three key points. The Armenian side is more of the way I see it, more of a frustration of why can you not see that we're suffering, and why can you not see that these are not occupied, these are liberated regions, and why can you not see that, why can't you do proper? Why can't you read a book and realize that we haven't done that we're not equal sort of parties? Why can't you see who's the victim and who's the aggressor? And this is why I think there is that there's the slight distortion in reporting, depending actually on the outlet. Not all of them. We have to be also fair, but yes, there are various factors, and And the end result is that in the end, I feel that people just walk away still confused as to what's going on. And that means that the news agencies have failed. Forget about Armenians and Azeris. If you cannot really explain what's happening, I think it's something that perhaps they have to look into. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I would broadly agree with what's been said. I mean, I think there are kind of four factors. One is the asymmetry in terms of the numbers of reporters who are actually on the ground. Another one, which is related to that, I guess, to a degree, is that we've had martial law declared, and that's restricted the kinds of information that can be transmitted. There's the point about the obscurity of this conflict. It takes quite a lot of explaining to situate and to explain. And so we have kind of quite simplified reporting, I think, as a result of that. And then I think there's a lot of genuine confusion about who is going after who has bombarded whose city. And I mean, I would say that the missile strikes on Ganja, I mean, I think I understand the intent. It's meant to be a kind of a deterrent. But it does also, it makes it more difficult, or it facilitates the both sides type of reporting. So, I think there are kind of costs in those terms from that. But yeah, I mean, those are the core factors that I would identify.
Thank you, everyone. I think let's stop here. Everyone is tired. Thank you so much for sharing your opinions, expertise, and views. It's important to have these conversations. Like Susan said, we'll think more what to do, what other discussions to organize. Please email us, keep in touch, visit our website, and let's hope for peace.